안녕하십니까. 경희대학교 사회학과 송재룡 교수입니다.
Jae-ryong, professor of Department of Sociology at Kyung University. This year celebrates the 40th anniversary of UN International Day of Peace. Kyung University system has been holding Peace Bar Festival International Conference every year to talk about the international challenges. This year, we have planned a series of dialogues that will continue until the end of this year in this context of such history and tradition. Ecological and civilizational crisis facing humanity has urged us to radically rethink the limits and potential of Homo sapiens civilization. Especially the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic the world has been experiencing for the past 2 years has made us feel the crisis more urgent than ever before. Climate disaster, loss of diversity, depletion of resources, pandemic, bipolarization, and inequality in our society, all these planetary issues make it clear that we indeed head toward a crisis. Quest for immediate action for planetary crisis is the theme that has been prepared for Kyung University system to organize this series of dialogue titled No Time to Lose, a quest for immediate action for planetary crisis to shed light on transformation in our knowledge, politics, and mind. This dialogue series consists of 4 dialogues. On the September 17th, we have the first dialogue, which was titled The Crisis of Civilization on Earth and Revolution of Consciousness. And the third dialogue, we have invited world-renowned professor to talk about the crisis of civilization on Earth and revolution in consciousness. For the third dialogue, we have invited world-renowned Professor Avi Loeb, a chair professor, Harvard University's Department of Astronomy via video. In order to change the future, we must change the knowledge that requires us to fundamentally rethink the modern ways of thinking that has sustained us. In this context, we have prepared this dialogue to explore the existing paradigm of knowledge and the transitional knowledge for the universe as we know it. Together with Professor Avi Loeb of Department of Astronomy at Harvard University, we will find a new starting point for the transformation of the modern view of the universe. We need to pay attention to the limits of human-centered ways of looking at the universe and be open to the possibility of an alien intelligent creature visiting the solar system. I would like to invite you to take an opportunity to engage in an intellectual experiment. And in this regard, the topic for today's talk is the arrival of extraterrestrial intelligence in the solar system. Will the identity and destiny of the Earth be rewritten? Moderator and discussion for this dialogue is Professor Hyung Mok from Department of Physics and Astronomy at Seoul National University. Let me introduce them to you. First, world-renowned astrophysicist Professor Avi Loeb has been the professor at the Department of Astronomy at the Harvard University since 1993. He is now Frank B. Baird Junior Professor after serving as the chair of the department. He is also the founder and first director of the Harvard Black Hole Initiative and is also the director of the Institute of Theory and Computation at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. He has also served as chair of the Board of Physics and Astronomy at the National Academies of the United States. In particular, Professor Avi Loeb suggested that Oumuamua, observed through the Pan-STAR telescope of Haleakala Observatory in Hawaii in October 2017, was not simply an interstellar celestial body, but an artifact potentially created by an extraterrestrial intelligence. This year, he has published related books, Extraterrestrial, The First Design of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth and Life in the Cosmos. He has also launched the Galileo Project for exploring alien artifacts. And Professor Hyung Mok Lee, he is also an astrophysicist. He has received his PhD in astrophysics from Princeton University in 1986. And Professor Lee served as a researcher at the Canadian Institute for Theoretical astrophysics and has been a professor at Busan University. Since 1998, he has been working as an associate professor of physics and astronomy at the Seoul National University. He has also served as the director of Korea Gravity Wave Research Cooperation Group and also as the president of Korea Astronomy and Space Science Institute. In 2011, Professor Hyung Mok Lee, also along with the International Joint Research Team, including Professor Toshio Matsumoto of Japan Institute of Space Science and others, using the space telescope Akari to observe the light emitted by stars that were born about 300 million years after Big Bang. There will be a free discussion after the 20-minute presentation by Professor Avi Loeb, and then Professor Lee Hyung Mok will lead the conversation with Professor Loeb. Now, Professor Avi Loeb, please start your lecture.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much for hosting me. It's a great pleasure and privilege to speak to all of you, and I very much look forward to your questions at the end. I will focus in this short presentation, 20 minutes, on my book, Extraterrestrial, that was published about 8 months ago. You can see it in the middle of this slide. And if I had to summarize it with one sentence, I would say, when you are not ready to find exceptional things, you will never discover them. What you see on the right side is a textbook that I published 3 months ago about life in the cosmos. And it's intended to serve researchers that search for either primitive life in the form of microbes or intelligent life in the form of technological signals that we might find. What you see on the left side is a photograph of a picture that was hung on the walls of the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Science and Humanities in October 2020. The picture that is on the wall was taken by the German photographer Herlinde Quilbel, who came to my office at Harvard a couple of years ago and asked me to write on the palm of my hand the question that I regard as most important in science. And I wrote, "Are we alone?" Now, the one thing I've learned over several decades of practicing astronomy is a sense of cosmic modesty. Not only that we are not at the center of the universe, as people thought thousands of years ago, but also what we find in our backyard is not special, not privileged. We now know that about half of the sun-like stars have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. And if you count all the stars in the universe, you conclude that there are more habitable Earth-like planets in the observable volume of the universe than there are grains of sand on all beaches on Earth. So when I see a painting like the one depicted in the middle of this slide of an emperor that conquered a piece of land on Earth, I'm not very impressed, because it's no different from an ant that hugs a single grain of sand on the landscape of a huge beach. Showing off in the entire universe is an oxymoron. But I can understand where it's coming from. This is a picture of my two daughters when they were young, And when they stayed at home at a young age, they thought that they are the smartest in the universe because they compared themselves to the family members. And that perception changed when we took them to the kindergarten and they met kids that might be smarter than they are. And so our civilization will mature only when it meets others. And we know from observing the universe that most stars formed billions of years before the sun. And since many of them have a habitable Earth-sized planet, it is possible that a technological civilization similar to ours predated us by 1 billion years or more. And we are currently developing artificial intelligence systems that drive cars. In the coming years, these systems may outsmart us, and you can imagine sending them to space. In fact, AI astronauts will be much better than human astronauts because they can live much longer and they are not as sensitive to the hazardous conditions in space. Humans are not really designed to be in space for long periods of time because Darwinian selection prepared humans to survive on the surface of the Earth, but not in space. And so, if we can imagine a future by which we will send out artificial intelligence systems with 3D printers to space so that they can make copies of themselves as they land on different planets, maybe another civilization that predated us already did that 1 billion years ago. And over a period of 1 billion years, these probes could have populated the entire Milky Way galaxy. And so the question is, are we living in such a reality? And this is not a philosophical question. This is a question which we can answer using modern scientific tools. We should not repeat the mistake that philosophers made 4 centuries ago when they told Galileo Galilei that they know the sun moves around the earth, that the earth is at the center of the universe, and therefore they don't want to look through his telescope. He was arguing that the earth moves around the sun. So they put him in house arrest. Today, they would have canceled him on social media. But that didn't really change the trajectory of the earth around the sun. When we launch space missions today, we rely on the fact that the earth moves around the sun, and the view of these philosophers, as much as it was popular 4 centuries ago, is completely irrelevant. So the truth is not decided by how many likes an idea has on Twitter. It's decided by evidence. And evidence is obtained by looking through our telescopes. And so in 2017, a survey telescope in Hawaii named Pan-STARRS that discovered the first object from outside the solar system that came near Earth. The name of this object was Oumuamua, which means a scout in the Hawaiian language. And we knew that the object came from outside because it moved too fast to be bound to the sun. You can see the object circled in blue in the middle of this picture. And at first, astronomers thought, well, it's probably a rock that came from another star. But it looked really unusual. First of all, it originated from a special frame of reference, the so-called local standard of rest, which is the frame that you get to when you average over the motions of all the stars in the vicinity of the sun. It is like a local parking lot. And Oumuamua was at rest in the local standard of rest. Only 1 in 500 stars is so much at rest as Oumuamua was. It was like a buoy sitting at rest on the surface of the ocean, and the sun, like a giant ship, bumped into it and gave it a kick. This is the trajectory of Oumuamua around the sun, dated. And that's the kick that the object received by the gravitational force of the sun. But there were more anomalies about this object. It didn't look like a comet. There was no cometary tail of gas or dust around it. In fact, the Spitzer Space Telescope looked very deeply and couldn't find anything around it. But as the object was tumbling every 8 hours, the amount of sunlight that was reflected from it changed by a factor of 10. And that implied that the object has an extreme shape. It's at least 10 times longer than it is wide, projected on the sky. And actually the best fit to the variation of reflected sunlight was that of a pancake shape, a flat object, not cigar-shaped. Now, there were a number of additional anomalies. First of all, we didn't expect this object in the first place. A decade earlier, I wrote a paper that forecasted how many rocks we should see from other planetary systems if they were similar to the solar system, and we didn't expect to detect anything with pan-stars. As I said, this object originated from the local standard of rest. Only 1 in 500 stars originate from there. Its brightness changed by a factor of 10 as it was tumbling. That meant an extreme shape, most likely flat, not cigar-shaped. And there was no trace of gas or dust around this object. But most importantly, there was an excess push of the object away from the sun. And given the fact that it did not evaporate, it couldn't have been the rocket effect from evaporating gases. And so the only explanation that I could provide to this push away from the sun that was smooth and declined inversely with distance squared from the sun, the only simple explanation I could think of was that it's being pushed by reflecting sunlight. And in order for that to be effective, the object had to be very thin, sort of like a sail, but being pushed by reflecting light, not the wind. And nature doesn't make sails or thin objects. So I suggested maybe it's artificial. And the alternative that most of the scientific community took was that it's of a natural origin. But all the suggestions that were made for a natural origin had to contemplate a rock or an object of a type that we have never seen before. So, for example, there was a suggestion that it's a cloud of dust particles, very loosely bound, 100 times less dense than air, that is being pushed by reflecting sunlight because it's so lightweight, like a feather. The problem with that is when such a cloud of dust particles gets close to the sun, it is heated by hundreds of degrees and it cannot maintain its integrity. There was a suggestion that maybe it's a chunk of frozen hydrogen, a hydrogen iceberg. And then when the hydrogen evaporates, we cannot see it because it's transparent. We've never seen a hydrogen iceberg, but beyond that, together with my colleague, Thim Huang, who is in Korea right now watching this presentation, we showed that such an object would not survive the journey through interstellar space. It will get evaporated very quickly by absorbing starlight. And then there was a suggestion, maybe it's a nitrogen iceberg, a chunk of frozen nitrogen. Again, we've never seen it, but the idea was that it was chipped off the surface of a planet like Pluto. The problem with this suggestion is there is not enough nitrogen available. And so the fundamental question is whether Oumuamua was natural or artificial. And the way I think of this is that when you walk on the beach, most of the time you see rocks that are naturally produced. That's similar to the comets or asteroids that we have seen in the solar system before. But every now and then you see a plastic bottle, and that provides an indication that there is a civilization out there. And perhaps Oumuamua was the plastic bottle. Now we have discovered another object a year ago. In September 2020, the Pan-STARRS telescope, the same telescope that discovered Oumuamua, found an object, and the astronomers gave it the name 2020 SO. And this object exhibited an excess push away from the sun by reflecting sunlight with no cometary tail, just like Oumuamua. But then a few weeks later, the astronomers realized it actually came from Earth. In 1966, if you extrapolate the trajectory back in time, it comes from Earth, and it's a rocket booster that was launched in a lunar lander mission in 1966. So we know that this object is artificial because we produced it. And we know that it had thin walls, not because it was a sail, but for a different purpose. So it's possible that Oumuamua was something like it. The only question is, who produced Oumuamua? And you can imagine a caveman finding a cell phone. The caveman would argue that the cell phone is a rock of a type that he had never seen before, just like some astronomers argued that Oumuamua is a rock that we had never seen before. And if the caveman says business as usual afterwards and throws away the cell phone, that will be the end of it. But if the caveman is curious, he might press a button and realize that this unusual rock can record his voice. And if he presses another button, he would realize that it records his image. And then it would be obvious that it's not a rock. And so for us, it would be really interesting to identify rocks of a type that we have never seen before, land on them, and press some buttons. And they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book. I wouldn't need to write the book if we had a high-resolution image of Oumuamua. And what you see here is a picture of the asteroid Bennu that was taken by the OSIRIS-REx mission that landed on it. You can clearly see that it's a rock. Now, on the 25th of June this year, the Director of National Intelligence in the United States delivered a report to the US Congress talking about 143 objects that were identified by military personnel whose nature is unclear. And this report would never be made public if there was a suspicion that these objects were human-made. They behaved in ways that we don't fully understand. And so when I heard about it, I immediately reached the conclusion that if the government, the most conservative organization, is admitting that it has data, and we see only the tip of the iceberg of this data that is not classified, but there is data that indicates something real out there that we don't fully understand, then it's the obligation of scientists to clear it up. And so I announced the Galileo project. Around the same time, a few very wealthy individuals came to the porch of my home and asked me questions about my book, Extraterrestrial. They were inspired by the vision. And within a couple of weeks, I had $2 million that allowed me to establish a new project where the idea is that we would look for the answers through new telescopes, the way Galileo did. And so we called the project the Galileo Project, because we realized that extraordinary conservatism leads to extraordinary ignorance. And our goal is to raise funds at the level that is at least 10 times larger, so that we can first identify objects like Oumuamua, figure out their nature, but also objects like these unidentified aerial phenomena that were reported to the US Congress. A meter-sized telescope can obtain a megapixel image of a human-sized object at a distance of 1 kilometer. And actually, I found such a telescope online. It says, add to the bag, and if you click on that, it costs you $500,000. So apparently there are some people that add it to their bag. But the point is, with such a telescope, such a mirror, you could potentially resolve the head of a pin at a distance of 1 kilometer. You can tell the difference between a label saying made in country X here on Earth and a label saying made on exoplanet Y far away. So it's not a philosophical question. We just need a high resolution image to figure out the nature of those unidentified aerial phenomena. And that's what we plan to do. We actually just purchased a number of instruments that would allow us to build the first telescope system that will have sensors in the visible band, in the infrared, in the radio band. We'll have an audio sensor. And the goal would be to collect all the data possible in the scientific way so that we have full control over our instruments. The data will be available to the public and will be analyzed in a straightforward manner, the way science is done. And we will simply try to get to the bottom of this question. What is the nature of these unidentified aerial phenomena? What is the nature of objects like Oumuamua? That will be the second objective of this project. And we currently have 80 scientists involved in the project. So there is this paradox that the famous physicist Enrico Fermi raised 70 years ago at lunch in Los Alamos. They talked about extraterrestrials, and Fermi asked, where is everybody? If they are out there, why don't we see them? And to me, this sounds very pretentious because it assumes that they care about us. It's just like sitting at your home and saying, nobody is knocking on my door, therefore I don't have neighbors. But most of the time, nobody is knocking on your door, and recorded history is only 10,000 years old. That's 1/1,000,000th of the age of the Earth. So if there was a visit 1 million years ago, we would not notice it. And 1 billion years ago, there were only microbes here. And it's also possible that most civilizations are dead by now. So there is a very short window of opportunity for us to communicate with them, to have a phone conversation. But a better approach would be to search for equipment that they sent into space. And I call that archaeology in space because it's similar to digging in the ground and looking for relics left behind by cultures that predated us here on Earth. And that's a better approach because any relics accumulate in space, just like plastic bottles on the surface of the ocean. They accumulate over time. And you don't need to be at the same time. And my hope is that finding those relics, which is a new approach that the Galileo project is now initiating, that was never taken by scientists before. By finding those relics, we will be inspired to behave better. Because when I look at human history, what I see over and over again is groups of people trying to feel superior relative to other people. The best example is the Second World War, when Nazi Germany triggered the death of 75 million people worldwide. That was 3% of the world population in 1940. It's 20 times more than the number of deaths triggered by COVID-19 so far. 20 times more just by a group of people that decided to feel superior relative to other people. And my hope is that if we find a smarter kid on our cosmic block, a much more advanced civilization that will inspire us to see our differences as meaningless and to treat each other with respect as equal members of the human species. Thank you.
예. 예.
Thank you, Professor Loeb. It was a very interesting and intriguing presentation.
반갑습니다.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Professor Loeb. In 1994, I've had the chance to visit Harvard University for a seminar, and I remember you being there.
굉장히 작은 그룹에서
It was a very small group seminar, so I clearly remember everybody who was there. But I haven't had the chance to meet you again since then.
지금부터 제가
Now, let me ask you some questions. And I have a lot of questions, so
서류로
I have prepared a list of questions. First, recently you have come out with this bestseller book called Extraterrestrial. As soon as it was published, it became a bestseller. And there were many responses to your work. And you said that you were kind of fascinated because many people said that they could communicate with preschool children now. And former President Barack Obama praised Korean parents for being so enthusiastic about their children's education. In fact, this interest must come from the typical attitude of Korean parents who view their children as power or as knowledge. View knowledge as power. However, you have expressed concern that the scientific community in the United States academic activities based on pure intellectual curiosity are not encouraged anymore. So for a scientist, human existence can be a source of little bit of joy and meaning of life that can come from diligent scientific research. Where do you think scientific innovation or creative in your field usually comes from?
Well, thank you very much for hosting me. And I wanted to say that I have a great respect for the Korean culture. One of the most vivid memories that I have from my childhood is sitting at dinner and asking a difficult question and noticing that the adults in the room pretend that they know much more than they actually know. It was obvious from their answer. And that was the good experience. The bad experience was when the adults in the room would dismiss the question as uninteresting just because they didn't know the answer to it. And I regard science as a privilege of maintaining our childhood curiosity. Especially after you get tenured in academia, you have the freedom, the job security. And I expected to be surrounded by like-minded people that once they get tenure will be just curious. But what I found is a different reality. When there was a talk about Oumuamua at Harvard, one of my colleagues that worked on rocks for decades in the solar system. When we left the room, he said, Oumuamua is so weird, I wish it never existed. And that was a reaction that was completely opposite to what I expect from a scientist. A scientist should say, something new shows up. It's an opportunity for me to learn about nature, something that I don't already know. But what happens very often in academia is that people pretend to be experts in a subject area, and if nature presents new evidence for something different, the expert just shoves it under the rug and pretends that it's nothing new, because otherwise it may imply that there is part of reality that was unknown and that is not described by the expertise, the knowledge, the body of knowledge that this expert developed over decades. And most people in academia would like to get honors, awards. They don't want to appear as if they cannot figure out something based on their pre-existing knowledge. But I should remind everyone that, for example, quantum mechanics was not expected a century ago, and Albert Einstein had a problem with it. He called quantum mechanics as strange and having spooky action at a distance, and he said that cannot be the case, and he was wrong. And the point is that science is a learning experience. We should be open-minded. We should not be too attached to our ego, but learn from evidence. Because, you know, the knowledge that we have is just an island in an ocean of ignorance. And if we operate with modesty, admitting when we don't know something and trying to learn from the facts, we have a chance to make progress. And it's obvious why a lot of scientists have a problem with discussing extraterrestrial intelligence. It threatens our ego. We better not look through the window. But the problem is that not looking through the window will not get rid of our neighbors. It's just like my daughters saying they don't want to go to the kindergarten because they're worried that there might be smarter kids there. But the existence of those kids is independent of what my daughters wanted. And we can think of the solar system as a mailbox where we can look for mail that arrive to us, for packages. And of course, we can stay at home and claim that we have no mail and ignore it. And it's a circular argument. If we argue that we don't have extraordinary evidence and we are not funding at the same time the search, we will never find that evidence. At the same time, you see mainstream scientists searching for the dark matter. We don't know what most of the matter in the universe is. And over the past 40 years, since I was a student, we invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the search for specific types of particles. We have not found them. So if we start now with a search for relics of other civilizations, and we invest hundreds of millions of dollars, then in 40 years, we will be at exactly the same point as the searches for dark matter are right now. And they are considered as part of the mainstream. So why shouldn't the search for things that we are sending to space be part of the mainstream? That's my surprise at the reaction of the academic community to this subject. And I very much hope that it will change, because the public cares a lot about this question, and the government as well. In 2 weeks, I'm supposed to appear together with the head of NASA and the director of national intelligence in Washington, D.C. at the National Cathedral. And just the event itself already implies that serious people are taking this subject seriously. It's just that the academic community is not catching up. And you would have expected it to be exactly the other way around. Usually, blue sky ideas should have been promoted first in academia.
예, 고맙습니다. 호기심을 유지하는 것이 굉장히 중요합니다.
Maintaining curiosity is critically important. Yes, I agree.
레이저를 발명해서 노벨
By inventing laser, receiving the Nobel laureate, he said the first sentence in his annual report, let me repeat that. He said, I'm curious. Thank you very much. Let me ask second question. Regarding intellectual curiosity, your childhood as well as the childhood of your colleague and co-author of the recent book, Manas B. Lingam, were very interesting. Professor, you seem to have had a lot of conversation with the parents in farm in Israel in your childhood. You have devoured philosophical books and constantly raised fundamental questions. And also, Manas B. Lingam also talked a lot with the parents, grandparents, and had a big questions, and ensuing studies in various fields of physics must have been the great help. And I'm sure that this was the foundations of writing a great book. Lingam's early interest in Indian myth and legend and your early awakening to the classics of the humanities may have been the driving forces that made two of you who are today. So, as a scientist, what do you see as the advantages of having early access to humanities and classical literature?
Oh, I think it's extremely important. So there are two things in my childhood that shaped my adulthood. One is that I was born on a farm. I used to collect eggs every afternoon, and I was very much connected to nature. I was not a social animal like the city kids. And even today, you know, when I married my wife, I promised her not to have any footprint on social media. So I don't care how many likes I have on Twitter. I think on my own, without being influenced by groupthink. That's the first aspect of my childhood that makes me a bit different. The second is that I was very interested in philosophy, as you mentioned, and then circumstances forced me to study physics because I had to serve in the military in Israel. It's obligatory. And I ended up in astrophysics and received tenure at Harvard. And at that point, I realized that even though it was an arranged marriage, I'm actually married to my true love. Because in astrophysics, there are deep philosophical questions that we can address using the scientific method. And using instruments is much more powerful than using people as detectors. That's what I tell often when people ask me about eyewitness testimonies. And the advantage of having a philosophical mind while doing research in science is that you look at the broad picture. So what happens very often is that scientists drill in a very narrow niche and eventually develop an expertise that is rather narrow, and they reach the bedrock of their expertise and they cannot drill anymore. So after a certain age, they just do relatively little in drilling deeper, and they just train other people. Whereas if you have a broader view, you can select other problems to work on, and also you can decide about which problems are more significant to humanity. And for me, the question, are we the smartest kid on the block or not, is one of the most fundamental in science, because if there is some equipment flying out there, we might import it to Earth, and that would have huge financial implications. It will change also our aspirations for space and the way we perceive ourselves in the universe. And we can learn from them. You know, we are just 100 years into our scientific development. And imagine a civilization that was around for 1 million years or 1 billion years. They know much more than us. They could potentially, if they understand how to unify quantum mechanics and gravity, they may be able to create a baby universe in the laboratory. So all kinds of qualities that we assigned, for example, in religious scripts to God, like creating life, creating the universe, that may be done by a sufficiently advanced scientific civilization. And so when we say humans were created in the image of God, it may actually be the image of advanced scientists out there. And if we find them, they would look like an approximation to God. I think most likely our first contact would be with artificial intelligence systems because they can travel the distance and they are autonomous and they don't need guidance. And it takes a long time for signals to go back and forth across the Milky Way galaxy, tens of thousands of years.
예, 철학적인 질문을
So that
하고 있는 것이 굉장히
I know it's very important to keep on asking philosophical questions. And let me move on to the next question.
아까 그 강연
And you have briefly talked about this in your presentation. The U.S. government recognized officially the UAP phenomena.
직전의 인터뷰에서
And in your previous interview, you said that it was very unhealthy for the government to make a statement without any conclusions. And
이제 많은 것이 이제
you're saying a lot of it still is kept a secret.
뿐만 아니라
And in addition, you said that it is undesirable for the scientific community to ignore the possibility of extraterrestrial origin. Could you be more specific about how the government and the scientific community should be taking these issues?
Yes, so I think we are seeing just the tip of the iceberg because most of the iceberg is classified. Most of the data was obtained by classified instruments. And the US government is not interested or not willing to release that data because it will reveal the nature of the sensors that are being used to monitor the sky in the US. It's not so much about the data itself, it's about the instruments that are used to collect the data that are classified. But the Galileo project, for example, will buy off-the-shelf instruments. We know that the sky is not classified. Astronomers look at the sky all the time. But the Galileo project is different from astronomical observatories. If there is a bird flying above a traditional observatory, the astronomers will ignore it. We will look at the bird. And if we see a drone, we will look at the drone. So a bird, if we get a high-resolution image of it, it would not be very interesting for me as a physicist. I will be glad to transfer the data to a zoologist. If we see a drone or an airplane that says made in a foreign country, I'm sure it will be of interest to residents of Washington, D.C. But again, it would be as boring to me as a bird. But if we see something else, I would like to know what it is. Is it a natural phenomena in the atmosphere of the Earth that we haven't realized before? Or is it some object that is doing very strange things that are not reproducible by human-made technologies? And similarly, about an object like Oumuamua, I would like to get a high-resolution image of it and perhaps even land on it. Because I believe that this is not a question that philosophers could answer. You know, there was an article in Nature Astronomy magazine just a few months ago by a philosopher who argued that based on philosophical reasoning, Oumuamua must be natural in origin. And I said to myself, haven't we learned something after 4 centuries following the situation with Galileo?
예, 그 갈릴레오 프로젝트에 대해서 이야기를 하셨기 때문에 제가 그 관련된
Since you are asking about the Galileo project, let me ask another question. In relation with the Galileo project, you have explained the background of that, and the pan star that identified Oumuamua, and
굉장히 자주 관측하는
we were able to identify various things, and there are numerous projects. Teloma Transient Factory and Vela Rubin Telescope. So we have different kinds of the telescope. And also in Korea, we have KMT. I don't know if you are aware of that. So we have that kind of telescope. Now, Galileo project, let's talk about that. What's the major differences in I believe in terms of the functionality, it's same, but what are the differentiations between the existing telescope with that of the Galileo?
Right. So the Galileo project will have a component that is looking at unidentified aerial phenomena. So these are objects moving through the atmosphere of the Earth much faster on the sky than distant sources that you see in astronomy. So in that sense, all the existing telescope systems are not really monitoring objects that are very close to us. By the way, I was asked by the Harvard administration whether this project, the Galileo project, is part of my day job. And my answer was yes, because throughout my career, I was analyzing data that was obtained by telescopes. And the same is true for the Galileo project. And there is no lower limit on the distance of the objects of interest in astronomy. We look at the sun, we look at meteors, we look at asteroids, at comets. These are relatively nearby objects. So I said the Galileo project is looking at even closer objects, but there is no limit to the distance. And so that's part of my astronomical research. So that the difference between the Galileo telescopes is that we are looking at nearby objects for one branch of the project, and then the other branch will focus on Oumuamua-like objects that could be discovered by, for example, the Vera Rubin Observatory that will come online in 2 years. It could find one such object every month or two, but that would not be sufficient in order to understand the nature of the object. What we aim to do is send a camera that will fly by such an object if we get an alert a year in advance or a few months in advance, and then take a high-resolution image or try to get much more information than we had about Oumuamua so that we can infer the nature of this object. Is it a nitrogen iceberg? Is it a hydrogen iceberg? Is it a cloud of dust particles? Or maybe it's an artificial object with bolts and screws on it. And we can tell the difference if we have good enough data. Now, I should say, we met back in 1994. And back then, I was a very different scientist. I was a young scientist trying to establish himself in the field. And I would still have creative ideas. But when I made suggestions to the community that were innovative, almost all the time, these ideas were dismissed on the spot. And then I learned from experience that an idea that I proposed was dismissed on the spot, and if someone else picked it up, it would turn out to be the hottest idea in the field for a decade. And it happened to me several times. And only about 5 years ago, I then decided, forget about it. I don't need the approval of other people. If I believe that something is interesting, it will eventually catch up. In this case, with the Galileo project, once we detect evidence and identify the nature of these unusual objects, I'm sure that the mainstream of the scientific community would say, oh, of course, we said it all along. There were people discussing these things back in the 1960s.
예, 알겠습니다.
Thank you.
사실 그 외계 생명체에
So
대한
back to the extraterrestrial or alien life.
사실 그 천문학자들 가운데 그
Astronomers,
외계 생명체의 존재 가능성에 대해서
well,
의심을 가진
many
사람은
of the astronomers believe in the possibility of alien life. Most of them believe it's possible. However, when it comes to the possibility of meeting them and interacting with them, some people tend to be very skeptical. Professor, you have also shown a deep interest in the traces potentially left by alien technology rather than the existence of alien life. And I think the typical example of this is Oumuamua. What kind of tangible results do you think could have been achieved if the scientific community came together to study this Oumuamua interstellar object more actively?
Yeah, I think we would know much more. And in fact, I think that's the lesson for future objects that would look weird, unlike any comet or asteroid that we have seen before. Just imagine the Perseverance rover, which is now on the surface of Mars. It's looking for traces of primitive life on the surface of Mars. And no scientist has a problem with that, because even if it finds evidence for microbes that used to exist on Mars, these would be forms of primitive life, and we can feel superior relative to those microbes. But imagine if Perseverance bumps into the wreckage of a spaceship that represents technologies that we do not possess. That would imply that our civilization is not the smartest on our cosmic block. And that would be a blow to our ego. And I should say physicists are very happy in their profession, because for 100 years, we used laboratory experiments to formulate the laws of physics. And the atoms out there in the universe obey these laws very precisely. And they are basically slaves to these laws. You know, we make laws in society and a lot of people do not obey them. But all the atoms in the universe obey the laws of physics that were formulated in laboratory experiments. And that's remarkable. But it also gives us a sense of arrogance, because we can forecast what these atoms will do, and they will do it. And also we understand how they operate. So we are clearly very smart in that context. And the only context in which we might not be smart is if there is another scientific civilization that figured out more than we did, because it had more time. And that's the idea that a lot of scientists don't like, because it's threatening to their ego. But my point is, we can make a quantum leap in our knowledge. We can learn from them. If it saves us 1,000,000 years, so be it. It may feel like cheating in an exam where you get the answer to deep questions like what was before the Big Bang, what is the dark matter, what is inside the black hole. These are questions to which we don't have an answer. But if they have an answer, or if we can figure it out from their equipment, I'm very much for it, rather than closing ourselves off with our ignorance. Because the letter that we receive in the mail may have an important recipe for our salvation. And if we don't open it, then it may be just like a love letter that we find in the attic of our home long after its time has passed. And so, you know, if we learn from them, we might improve our future. We are facing a lot of dangers. Currently, all of our eggs are in one basket here on Earth. And meeting equipment from another civilization can open our eyes. I don't think these would be living creatures that we will meet. Most likely, it will be artificial intelligence. Some equipment that is potentially smarter than us, that in order to figure it out, we will have to use our own artificial intelligence systems, sort of like relying on our kids to interpret for us content that we find on the internet, because the kids are much more computer savvy. But we will learn from that experience, even if it's just equipment.
사실 제 질문은 그보다 좀 훨씬 단순한 거였었는데요.
Well, my question was actually much simpler.
가동하지 않았었는지 뭐 이런
My question is whether, much simpler than that, whether the telescope must have not been used properly, but it was a much more philosophical answer. And haven't we used our resources properly at the time when they were observing Oumuamua? So when people were watching Oumuamua, what went wrong? Didn't they use the equipment properly?
No, it's the prejudice that when they discovered it, everyone said, oh, it's probably a comet. In fact, it was given the official name of a comet. And then we didn't see any cometary tail. and the Spitzer Space Telescope put very tight limits on any carbon-based molecules around this object, and that excluded conclusively the possibility that it's a comet of the type of comets that we have seen before. So it was clearly not a comet. And then people said, okay, well, maybe it's an asteroid. It doesn't evaporate. But then it had all these other anomalies. And by the time it became clear that this is something different, we couldn't collect any more data. That was January 2018. So the astronomy community simply was not alert enough to consider how weird this object is and take as much data as possible. We could have had much more data than was taken. And perhaps we would have learned about the nature of this object from that data. But once the object went away, it became very dim. And so now it's 1 million times fainter than it was close to Earth. We cannot observe it anymore, and we cannot chase it. All of our rockets are too slow to reach it. And so what we need to do is find another object like it. And you know, when I find an ant in the kitchen, I get worried because it means that there must be many more ants out there. And in much the same way, if we found this object with pan-stars after just a few years, it means that if we continue to watch the sky, we would find more objects. I should mention an anecdote. There was once a fisherman. You can think of the Galileo project as a fishing expedition. We are just casting a net, trying to discover fish. I don't care if the fish will mostly be sardines, things that are not very exciting. So be it. Whatever we find, we will report. But there is this tale about a fisherman that announced that he discovered a new law of nature, that all fish are bigger than 5 centimeters. And when someone asked him, what is the size of the holes in your fishing net? He said 5 centimeters. So we have to be careful of that we are missing some fish because the holes in our fishing net are not small enough.
지금까지 뭐 과학자들의
So you have talked about the scientific attitude.
약간 좀 그 펀딩 이슈에 대해서 좀 물어보고 싶은 게 있습니다.
I have a question about funding issue. And compared to black dark matter research or alien life research, well, there's not much we know about this. But the biggest issue of the astrophysics these days would be 2 things, cosmology and alien life.
그런데 이제 그 지금
And
상당히 많은 자원이
actually, a lot of financial resources are going into that area. But are you saying the direction of funding is not right? Or do you think you still need more funding for that? So could you elaborate about that?
Yeah, so for 70 years, we searched for radio signals. And that's the wrong approach. It's like trying to have a phone conversation. You need the counterpart to be active. And my suggestion is to search for objects, which is a different approach because they could have been sent by a civilization that is not around anymore. And they accumulate in space. And that kind of a search was never funded. So when people say, give me extraordinary evidence before I would allocate funds to this search, that's a circular argument. And what I'm saying is that we have one example ourselves. We sent equipment into space in the form of 5 probes already. Voyager, New Horizons. We sent it into space. It will leave the solar system. If we are doing it just after 100 years of science and technology, they could have done it many times over the past several billion years. So it's not completely speculative because we now know that planets the size of the Earth are very common around stars like the Sun. And so we are not that privileged. All I'm saying is stars that were born billions of years before the sun and led to a technological civilization like ours could have produced objects in space that would look like spacecrafts. And why should we assume that we are privileged and not even invest in that search? And that was the strategy so far, that people said we need extraordinary evidence in order to discuss this subject. I'm saying let's allocate funds to this search. And by the way, in the context of dark matter searches, we don't know what the nature of the dark matter, so it was a search in the dark. It was more speculative, I would argue, to look for weakly interacting massive particles. We haven't found them. And that shows that it was a speculation. And also, if we find dark matter, the nature of dark matter, it would have very little impact on our daily lives. Whereas if we find evidence for another civilization, it would have a major impact on society. And so it's clear, since the public cares about this subject, that we should fund this research. And what I'm saying is there was a little bit of funding, it was in the wrong direction. And what I was able to demonstrate after my book came out, I said, I will be able to attract funds into science that were previously not allocated to science. That's what I did. I got funders in the private sector that were inspired by my book, and they funded the Galileo project. And this money was not allocated to dark matter searches, so I'm not removing money from existing research. And I also said that it will inspire young people to enter science. And I demonstrated that. I got thousands of emails after the Galileo project was announced of people interested in contributing from their expertise. I have 4 exceptional undergraduate students at Harvard that volunteered to work nonstop on this project. And I have 80 scientists that volunteered to work on this project. And to me, the fact that there is so much excitement about it is a great benefit to science, because science does not need to be boring. If people are excited about a question, we should take advantage of it. I don't see any downside to examining evidence. And because wherever the evidence leads us, that's what we will learn. And if we find that Oumuamua was a nitrogen iceberg, something we've never imagined before, it means that there are nurseries making nitrogen icebergs that are far more common and prolific than what we find in the solar system, because in the solar system we haven't found it before. So it came from outside and it's being produced at much larger quantities than normal rocks that we are used to. So we learn something new about the universe. No matter what, if you collect evidence, you learn something new. And I just find it completely non-scientific for people to ridicule the subject, given that the government shows interest in it and the public shows interest in it. And 1,000 years ago, there were people claiming the human body has a soul, and therefore anatomy should be forbidden. Now, imagine if scientists would say, we do not want to operate the human body because it's controversial. There are some people saying nonsense about the human body, that it has a soul, the soul will be hurt by doing an operation. We don't want to deal with the human body. Where would modern medicine be? The duty, the obligation of science is to attend to questions that the public cares about, because the public funds science, and address them using the scientific method. And I don't see any problem addressing this question using the scientific method, except that my colleagues are pushing back on it.
예, 알겠습니다.
Thank you. The reason why I asked that question is because CFA and Korean Astronomical Institute, they have created a special instrument to identify this special existence, and we are making a lot of investment. That's why I asked that question. Let's go to the next question. As you know, Carl Sagan and other scholars have already studied the SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, to search for intelligent life for a long time, but they weren't able to identify or receive any reliable signals despite decades of hard work. What kind of implication can you talk about this?
Right. So the searches were for radio signals primarily. And, even if you consider that, we started using radio communication just about 70 years ago. We had started using radio signals for 126 years since Marconi had the first transmission. So even if you start from then, it's only about a century old. And by now we have fiber optics for communication, so we are producing much less radio signals into space. And this is just a century of technological development. In the distant future, we might not use radio waves at all for communication. And so the point is, we don't know whether this window of opportunity that we are looking for of a rather primitive civilization that just started in the first century of its development, whether that is common, because if it's only a century out of the age of the Milky Way galaxy, that's 1 part in 100 million. So finding another civilization that is our age is very unlikely. Also, if you look at the way we behave, we might be short-lived. I was asked, how much longer do I expect our civilization to exist? And my answer was, well, if you select a random day during your life, what's the chance that this day would be the first day after you were born, your birthday? The chance of that is 1 in 10,000, because there are tens of thousands of days in the life of an adult compared to the first day in your life. So we existed as a scientific, technological civilization for about a century. What's the chance that it's the first century out of the life of 1 million years? It's 1 in 10,000. So if I had to guess, I would say much more likely, if we continue with the current policies, we would survive only a few more centuries. We are in our adulthood, so to speak. And if there is that filter of a very short window of time during which a civilization exists at a technological state similar to ours, and after which it destroys its environment, like we are destroying the climate, and eventually it perishes as a result of self-inflicted technological wounds, then that could explain the Fermi paradox, because then you ask yourself, what's the chance that you are finding another civilization exactly in that short window of time? And I should say, I can envision 3 classes, actually 4 classes of civilizations. You might say, okay, we are type C, where we are using the energy from the sun, from whatever nature gave us on Earth, whatever the astrophysical environment gave us. I would say that we are class D, because we are destroying the habitat that we were born into. Our policies are not trying to protect the climate, to protect what we were born to. We are actually negatively influencing it. But you can imagine a civilization class B, where it develops enough technology to build a platform where it would not depend on a star being next to it and providing it with the energy it needs. So being independent of the astrophysical environment is a higher class civilization, class B. And I hope we will get there, but I'm not sure. And then there is class A civilizations. Those are the civilizations that can recreate the astrophysical conditions around them. For example, can recreate the Big Bang in their laboratories.
예, 소설 같은 얘기예요.
That sounds like a science fiction.
I should say, I am not a fan of science fiction. I like fiction and I like science, but very often I don't like science fiction because a lot of the storylines violate the laws of physics, so I cannot enjoy it. But what I'm telling you is ideas that are based on the science we know, extrapolated. But I'm not trying to violate anything we know.
그 책을 읽다 보니까 노아.
As I was reading your book, there was a mention of Noah's Ark. And As a similar case, you talked about DNA and RNA information loaded along with the 3D printer and AI on a spaceship, sending it to another world so that there could be another creature starting in the universe. It might be too specific question, but as AI navigates in the universe, it could be very helpful. But instead of replicating DNA and RNA, do you think it's better to store that DNA and RNA in a container so that isn't it better to send the RNA and DNA itself instead of trying to get a copy of that with the 3D? Do you know what biologists are saying about this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And in fact, when I learned a couple of months ago that the New Horizons mission to Pluto took the ashes, it took 30 grams of ashes from Clyde Tombaugh's body. Clyde Tombaugh was the scientist who discovered Pluto. And so to commemorate his scientific accomplishment of discovering Pluto, the New Horizons mission that was sent to explore Pluto took 30 grams of the ashes from his body. And when I heard about it, I said, oh, that's very embarrassing, actually. Because what are ashes? Ashes are burned up DNA. So we took the genetic information about Clyde Tombaugh and destroyed it, burnt it up. Those ashes are no different than the ashes of a cigarette. And then we put those ashes, 30 grams of these ashes that have no information content, we put it in a spacecraft and we send it out of the solar system. If extraterrestrials find it, they would laugh at this primitive ritual that we have of destroying all the information about a person and then commemorating that person by sending it into space. It would have made much more sense scientifically for NASA to put an electronic record of the DNA of Clyde Tombaugh on New Horizons, or put a stem cell of Clyde Tombaugh on New Horizons so that the extraterrestrials would be able to reconstruct him. But I said that to the principal investigator of New Horizons, who is a member of the research team of the Galileo project. His name is Alan Stern. And he said to me that putting a stem cell on New Horizons would have been a bureaucratic nightmare at NASA. So to answer your question, I do think that an electronic record makes a lot of sense. Biological record of a DNA is a problem for NASA because there are issues with sending things, living things from Earth out there. But I agree with you that AI systems will not try necessarily to replicate biology on Earth, because perhaps, the biology we find on Earth, the life that we are part of, was perhaps just a result of a soup of chemicals that by random processes ended up in the way we are. And if you open a recipe book for cakes, then you find that out of the same ingredients, you can make very different cakes, and some of them taste much better. So what's the chance that what you find on Earth is the best form of life that you can imagine? Probably very small. And it would make much more sense for the AI systems to create better forms of life, or maybe not even life, not biological life, but something similar to themselves, replicate themselves. I have no problem with AI systems. I just participated in a forum 2 weeks ago where someone said that he's very worried about the future, because you never know if AI systems become autonomous, and they might go in directions that we do not approve. And I said to that person, you look very young. I said, you probably didn't have kids, because my experiences with raising kids is that you educate them at a young age and then you send them to the world. And of course, your kids may behave in ways that you do not approve. But you can always be proud of your kids. And in the same way, you can always be proud of your technological kids, of AI systems that we send into space. I have no problem being proud of autonomous systems.
예, 지금 이 행사를 주관하고 있는
Well, the organizer of this event today
지금까지 뭐 과학적인
is actually
우리 문명에 대한
is the global civilization, and now let's talk about civilization.
문명의 존재가
So you mentioned that
커다란 변동이 일어날 수 있습니다.
if the existence of the extraterrestrial civilization could be confirmed, this would bring about, once again, cataclysmic shift in our knowledge system. This may be a rather abstract question, but what kind of changes can we expect? At this point in time, most people, including scientists, already believe in the universality of the laws of the physics and accept the fact that the Earth is just one of the countless planets. Can it be really bring about the revolutionary change in the knowledge system? Should the identity or the paradigm of the Earthlings be changed?
Yeah, so first of all, there would be a change in our psychology. And I would make a parallel between that and what my daughters went through when they went to the kindergarten from home. Because once you realize there is a smarter kid on the block, the way you think of yourself is different. And for us, it's not just the way we think about our civilization, but the way we treat each other. I hope that it will inspire us to treat each other more kindly, because we are all part of the same species when we find evidence for another species out there that is more advanced than we are. But moreover, if the technologies we discover are far more advanced than what we can produce, then there would be a sense of humility that will come with discovering them, because we will recognize something similar to what a caveman recognizes when meeting a cell phone. It would look like magic to us, some of the things. It would look like an approximation to God if they can do things that are out of our imagination. And, you know, the real fundamental question is how to interpret them. We don't want to make the mistake that was made by the citizens of the city of Troy when the Trojan horse arrived and they had the wrong interpretation. But I don't think of extraterrestrials as a threat, because they had a lot of time. If they wanted to destroy us, they could have done it long ago. They wouldn't let us get to the current technological advances that we're getting to. So I don't think we pose a threat to them. They will not pose a threat to us. They probably look at us, if they collect data on us, just like the way we look at microbes. You know, we don't feel that microbes in any way endanger or put at risk our egos, because we feel superior relative to them. We can figure out ways to cope with them. So, I mean, I think it will change not only the psychology that I mentioned before, it could affect our religious beliefs, because, you know, there is a fundamental question. If humans are not the pinnacle of creation in the universe, if we are not the privileged species, if there is another species that is more privileged than we are, then you ask yourself, okay, it's just like finding that you have a brother or a sister that are more privileged in the universe. And, you know, that changes the way you think about yourself. So if there is God, you know, we were not the chosen ones necessarily. There was someone else that was far more lucky than we are, if we find someone like that. So again, it changes perspective. And then there is the question of our aspirations in space. If we realize that, in fact, we are not alone, that there is a lot of civilizations out there, then what we want to do in space changes. Because it's not just physical objects, the way that cosmologists talk about, the way that the physicists talk about all the time. And as I said before, physics gives you a sense of superiority, because you find the laws that control the material world, you feel superior relative to this material world. You can shape it. We feel as humans that if you were to write an equation that will forecast the way we behave, we will disobey this equation. So we are not controlled by laws that will tell us what to do. We prefer to believe that. So that's why we feel that we are superior relative to the material world. We can shape it. We can use it the way we want. But if there is someone else out there that is superior to us, that would be a psychological shock that will change everything in our future. I think it will be the most significant milestone in human history.
예, 그것이 이제
Yes.
외계인의 존재가 심리적인
So the alien creature,
을 벗어나 이제
we can go beyond the psychological shock, and I hope it's not such a big physical shock, because since the great navigation era, a lot of things that has happened has become a nightmare to many Asians. And I think, Professor Loeb, you know where I'm coming from? Especially in science fictions, when there is an alien, they usually start a war.
표현되고 있고 한데
And
Yeah.
낙관적인 견해를
you have shared a very optimistic view of aliens.
조금 더 그것에 대해서 좀 더
Would you like to talk more about that?
Yeah, I'm optimistic in nature, and I believe also that a peaceful extraterrestrials would be longer lived, because a combative, aggressive culture is likely to get into confrontations and may actually perish in some of those. And so my hope and my belief is that whatever we find would be peaceful. If they wanted to destroy us, they would have done it long ago. And in fact, I think we can learn from them. So the way I would think of it is the scientific way, that we better understand the reality that we live in, and that is always to our benefit. If we understand the virus COVID-19, then we can figure out how to design mRNA vaccine for it. If we recognize that we are changing the climate, then we can design policy that would try to moderate that change. If we understand that we are not alone in the universe and there are things out there, we could change our behavior to reflect that. And just ignoring reality is really the wrong approach. It was the wrong approach during the days of Galileo, and we know that, because now we have space missions and the laws of Newton and Einstein are being used routinely. And being aware of the reality that we live in is far more important than pretending that we are smart and we know everything. And I should say, in the mainstream of physics right now, there are ideas like the multiverse, like extra dimensions, like the string theory landscape, that perhaps will not be testable during our lifetime. And having those ideas as part of the mainstream of physics, of science, while ridiculing the search for things like us, when we know that we are not privileged in terms of the environment, is completely opposite of what it should have been. I just find this really surprising, that it's not the other way around, where all these speculative ideas about extra dimensions that we've never seen would be pushed to the periphery of science, whereas searching for something like ourselves, a technological civilization, not microbes, evidence for technological civilization, that should be center stage. That should receive most of the funding in space exploration, because that excites the public and that will change human history if we find something.
예, 그런 점에서 그 천체 고고학이라는 이야기를 이제 쓰고 계신데요. 뭐 상당히 재미있는 아이디어인 것 같고요. 특히 이제 달이나 화성이 천체 고고학의 장소로.
Yes, that's very interesting. You talked about space archaeology, which is very important, and you mentioned about the explorations of this space, finding out the legacy. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so in archaeology, we are finding relics left behind. These are physical objects from cultures that are not around anymore, that we cannot have a conversation with. And the same is very likely to have happened in space because, you know, the sun within 1 billion years will boil off all the oceans on Earth. So even if we do not destroy our environment, the sun will do it within 1 billion years, which is roughly 20% of the age of the sun. So we are now living at the last phase during which life on Earth could exist, because after that, everything on the surface of Earth would be burned up. You know, it's really ridiculous because there are humans, and I see that very frequently going through the halls of universities. You see statues or you see paintings of deans and presidents that wanted to preserve their physical appearance in the form of a monument. So they thought, we will build something physical, like a painting or a sculpture that represents the way we look, and that will keep us for a long period of time in the consciousness of other humans. But of course, within 1 billion years, all of these monuments would disappear. If we wanted to maintain what we find precious here on Earth right now, we should send it into space. That's the best way to build monuments that would last billions of years and outlast the sun. Just putting monuments in space that will be with artificial intelligence, that will carry our consciousness. And if we can think about it, it's possible that other civilizations already did that. And we can search for those probes. That would be the natural thing to do. And they can be rather small, actually. And my point is, this would be just like archaeology, because you are searching for relics left behind that are physical objects and that were accumulating over time, while the senders of these relics are not around anymore.
예, 저 시간이 이제.
Yes, we are running out of time, and this is going to be my last question.
링검하고 쓴
With Professor Lingam, you have written a book, and
본론 부분에서
in the conclusion of the book,
오늘날 인류는 이제
you said that humanity faces variety of challenges. They include pandemics, global warming, ocean acidification, large-scale loss of biodiversity, artificial intelligence, biochemical weapons, and solar explosions. You have identified various challenges that humanity faces. And the imagination, cosmos, universe, what kind of relationship do you think there is between the global problems and the cosmic imagination? And many businessmen, billionaires, are very much interested in commercializing such space travel. Do you think it's possible to create a culture where scientific communities in the world can concentrate on pure research? Can you be very brief, because we are running out of time?
Yes. So in recent months, Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos used their wealth to lift their body by 1% of the Earth radius. And they were very proud of that. But, showing off in space is an oxymoron, because the size of the universe is 10 to the power 19 times bigger than the size of Earth. So the motivation of space tourism or showing off is really not the right motivation. We should explore space, just like I said in my book, as Noah's Ark, as a way to preserve things that we find precious here on Earth in the long term. And currently all our eggs are in one basket. We should spread them in space. So space offers an opportunity to preserve things from a single point catastrophe, and also to learn about our global environment, about other cultures that may have been much more advanced, that may have gained a deeper understanding of nature from which we can learn.
예, 오랜 시간 동안
Thank you very much for your lecture and for your insightful answers. And I really hope to see you again in the near future. So I think we have to wrap up this dialogue now. Thank you very much, Professor Avi Loeb.
Thanks for hosting me.